Chapter 31 is pretty straightforward. There's two basic concepts here. The first are the new cum clauses. So you initially learned the word cum with the ablative to mean with. Cum, a different use of the word. It's actually probably best thought about as just a different word spelled the same, a homonym. A different word, cum, not with a noun, which is the case with when it's used as a preposition, but rather with a verb, is the cum temporal, circumstantial, and adversative clauses. The most common of these probably is the cum circumstantial, which I'll skip down to. So this is cum with a subjunctive verb. Cum causal and cum circumstantial are really a distinction for English speakers, for English or, for speakers of a different language, for how to translate this. They're functionally the same thing in Latin, and that is cum plus a subjunctive verb giving you the circumstances or some sort of causal information for the main clause. So it's going to create this subordinate clause that gives you general circumstances. When, since, although for the adversative sense. Again, adversative versus circumstantial are really an us distinction. Those are distinctions we're making for our translation purposes. In the Latin, this is a use of cum with a subjunctive verb to provide what we can generally describe as circumstantial information, whether that's concessive, adversative, or causal. Okay? Also, totally thing that happens is with indicative verbs. I'd say a little less often, but totally happens. The first clause of Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods is one of these. In fact, it's a cum tum clause, which are a slightly more tricky subset. But cum with an indicative is going to give you sort of temporal information, often contemporaneous or connected. While will often be a good translation, but when works. So it's more vivid, it's more in the moment rather than sort of general causal information. But I wouldn't push the distinction too far. An interesting thing to note is that cum tum is a correlative or correlatives. One introduces one clause and then the tum will introduce the primary clause. So cum introduces the what I'll call a subordinate clause, and then tum will introduce the primary clause. And usually it works best not to translate both. Usually you want to translate one or the other. You'll see that in practice. For instance, the example they give here, the cum vincimus tum pacem speras. When or while we are winning, you are hoping for peace. You could say something like, you are at that very moment, or you are at the same time. But we don't really talk that way, and that's sort of that almost feels like overbaking the tum. While pretty much does the same work, and saying something like at that same time feels insistent, feels like you should expect some extra words. If you saw that in English and went to look at the Latin, you should expect some extra words, sort of being emphatic about that. And tum just isn't that emphatic. It is just a correlative clause setting up some sort of contemporary action. So remember, cum with a noun is with, and cum with a verb is when in different senses. Highly irregular verb, extremely common. The verb fero feri tuli latum. The most common verbs are irregular. They stay irregular because they're being used so often, so they don't ever normalize as syntax changes. So it is not an accident that very common verbs are highly irregular. This is what we'd call a suppletive, which means it's taking different principal parts from different verbal origins. So it's not just irregularly spelled, though it is. The present tenses here are irregularly spelled. Pharaoh, furs, furt, right? See, Pharaoh, furs, furt. Certainly irregular, and the infinitive fere, that's irregular, although it should remind you a little bit of the verb to be, esse. There's an analogy there. You can think about that. So it's irregular in the present. It's also suppletive with its other principal parts. We have lots of words from Pharaoh, meaning to carry. The word Christopher, the name Christopher, means a Christ carrier, someone who bears Christ.
Transfer means to carry across. You can spend some time thinking about it and come up with a lot of them. And then we have lots of latus words. Since we're doing Latin, oblatus, ablative, is to take away. Away, latus, having been carried, a thing carried away. Um, so, Tuli, I'm sure we have some, but none spring to mind. So this is an irregular verb. Pay attention to its four principal parts. Something you should be able to just recite is fero, fere, tuli, latum. Let's see. It is otherwise, if you remember those principal parts, it is formed regularly upon those irregular principal parts. And what I have in mind here is this imperfect subjunctive, for instance. So this looks highly irregular, but if you remember, we're adding endings onto an infinitive. Then, if you can remember that the infinitive of pharaoh is fere, then it's perfectly regular. Then it's exactly what you'd expect. So, just make sure you have these principal parts internalized, and then recall that you're going to get some strange fert for the third person singular, and a few other strange forms.